Hi, I'm Stephen Roddy. I'm based here in the Digital Humanities Department, and I'm also a member of something called the Radical Humanities Lab. I've been in UCC now for a year, but the project I'm going to talk about has been going on for 7 years, as these kinds of projects tend to. I'm also going to set a timer so that I don't run over. All right, so I just want to start with a little kind of video of a sort of iteration of this overall project. It's going to focus on a project called signal to noise loops. Rather than talking through it all in detail, I'm going to go into some of the underlying ideas, specifically on cybernetics, which is a theme that keeps coming up here again and again. So that worked out well. But yeah, you heard some of it yesterday during the coffee break. Can you hear me? Firstly, am I speaking loud enough? Because I'm going to tend to walk away from the thing. No? Nah, I'll stay here. You're grand. You're grand. Right. So this is also a little clip of a different iteration of the project from a few years back during COVID. You can't see a huge amount. You can't really see a huge amount, but don't worry about that. The point is the sound. What is on the screen is just a map of Dublin, and it is showing some locations from noise sensors around Dublin City. So essentially, this entire project, signal to noise loops, is based on a sort of generative music idea. I created a series of generative music systems, starting back in 2017, when I put together the first one, based on these kind of cybernetic principles and taking data from a series of sensors around Dublin City and using them to make decisions about how the generative system would actually create music, essentially. So it's gone through a number of different iterations, but each one is based on the idea of cybernetics and cybernetic principles. So it's evolved the application of these cybernetic principles to create these systems. Each piece kind of treats Dublin City as mediated by the data. So I've got essentially data from Dublin that I'm treating as a performer or collaborator in a musical work. So you're kind of developing a generative system that works like an instrument. The data speaks to the instrument produces music essentially. So yeah, we'll go through some of the different iterations of the system because they change hugely as the years go on. But the whole idea is that the state of the system is determined by the state of the city as represented in the data at any given time. So certain versions of this were kind of live, so that it was pulling in data from the city as it was playing, and other versions were pulling in big kind of like chunks of data and using those to make decisions over time. So each performance is unique. You'll see yourself, there's kind of aesthetically they kind of sound similar as they kind of would tend to, because it's kind of, you'll see, don't worry about it. But I'm going to focus first on the theoretical underpinnings. So what is cybernetics and how do you create something on the basis of these sort of cybernetic principles? Okay, so for me, my approach to cybernetics came primarily from work done by a guy called Darren Pickles, who was focused on cybernetics as it applies to music. And for him, in his discussion of it over the last few years, and particularly in his thesis, he puts focus on these three kind of ideas. One is feedback loops. The other is this idea of emergent behavior, which is really, really hard to actually pin down what the hell that means. We can talk about that in a bit. And the other is this kind of flow of information between humans, machines, and environment. So he describes cybernetics as the science and study, and there's reasons for that kind of terminology that we'll get into later, of systems, and in particular, how information flows between man, machine, and environment in a matrix of feedback loops that may form emergent behaviors. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but hopefully it becomes a little bit more obvious. So another really kind of nice way of putting this from a cybernetician called Stafford Beer, who we're going to see a little bit more of as well, is that in a given cybernetic system, we define some initial parameters of the system, and then we run the system, run the program, we let it do its thing, and then we write out the dynamics of the system in the direction we wish to go. So we've talked a lot about AI, and what we do when we take a machine learning model and we train it on a load of data is we're trying to create a map of some kind of space in a way, a kind of territory. We're trying to map the whole thing out and be able to kind of say, okay, we can generate something on the basis of our understanding, this kind of holistic understanding of the space. Cybernetics works in a kind of different way where you're sort of steering the kind of system. You're not trying to map out every possible output of a system. You're trying to create some kind of system that can be steered in a certain direction. So it's kind of a different relationship that you have to a machine in cybernetics as opposed to AI. Okay, so I want to focus on two big ideas, first order and second order cybernetics, where they came from and what exactly they're about. So first order cybernetics began with the work of Norbert Wiener back in 1948. He was like the original cybernetics kind of theorist. He was a mathematician and I guess technically engineering computer science as well, but very much a mathematical approach to things. But his original book was Cybernetics Are Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. So his focus in the book was on creating some kind of like common system, sort of like teleological system that would describe communication between biological, mechanical, and electronic entities, but like on the same basis, to try to find some kind of like underlying principles to describe how information could flow between systems in this kind of a way. So he's focused on this idea of goal-directed behaviors guided by self-regulation through feedback and feed-forward loops, which is kind of a mouthful. But to get a sense of how this sort of feedback, feed-forward idea works, think of essentially a thermostat in your house, right? You set a kind of target temperature that you want your house to be at in your thermostat. Your house heats up, the boiler comes on to bring up the heat. If the heat goes up too high, there's a sensor watching, and that brings things down. You know, that brings you back to that like goal state, right? So this is this really basic kind of like underpinning idea in first order cybernetics, and you can kind of see it here in the diagram on the left over there. It's my right here, which is quite confusing. So you have some kind of input. It's causing something to happen in a system, and there's an output, but there's this feedback right back into the system again that's kind of measuring what that output is and changing the system on the basis of it. So the key kind of idea in this approach to these first-order cybernetics thinkers, their key kind of idea in their approach is this idea of homeostasis. You've got some kind of target, and you're trying to maintain a system around that target somehow. For example, the thermostat. So they were kind of like preoccupied with this idea, and we'll talk a little bit more about where that comes from in a minute. So at the same time, you had second order cybernetics. So it's not a movement that came after first order. Essentially, alongside first order cybernetics, people started to think in terms of what's now called second order cybernetics, but this was spreading beyond the kind of very kind of computerized engineering approach, first order cybernetics, into the biological, social, and eventually political. So this was primarily led by Margaret Mead, who's a cultural anthropologist you might have come across in other contexts, and Heinz von Forster, who was a scientist and philosopher. Gregory Bateson was also involved. The two key people here are Margaret Mead and Heinz von Forster, but Gregory Bateson, as an anthropologist and social scientist, was also involved. Gordon Pask, who's a very interesting artist, but also a kind of a psychologist of learning, interestingly enough, was involved too. You had Stafford Beer, who was very focused on kind of like business research early on, and then started to shift to politics, and actually got involved with the Allende government in Chile, and attempted to make a sort of cybernetic system of their economy, turn their economy into a cybernetic system that would not necessarily run itself. It was a second order thing. There were still people involved, but really kind of a crazy experiment. And finally, Francisco Varela, who was a biologist and contributed hugely to cognitive science. We've heard the term embodied cognition a few times today. He did write the book on embodied cognition originally. So very much focused on how mind arises out of matter, essentially. So started as a biologist, turned into a cognitive scientist. But the key thing these people were interested in was the idea of reflexivity. What happens when you have humans involved in these systems? And we can't just think about computation and think about these cybernetic ideas as happening away in a computer without any kind of interaction with us or us having any interaction back with them. So they're focused on human observation, but specifically the idea of reflexivity. So reflexivity, as described, all of this, I should say, is from Catherine Hale's book on cybernetics, well, post-humanism in general, the 1999 book. But how she kind of like typifies reflexivity in this context is the tendency of a system to evolve, change, and complexify in response to self-observation. So that wasn't any longer kind of just this sort of computational engineering approach. It was much more culturally embedded. All right. So there was two kind of tensions, obviously, between these camps. And interestingly enough, we've done a lot of talk about AI here over the last couple of days. The first order camp, who were quite focused on homeostasis, originally had John McCarthy as a real key kind of member, a real key driving force in the camp. And John McCarthy would have been a computer scientist who came up with the term AI, essentially as a way of getting away from cybernetics, making his own name, and getting funding. So it was essentially driven by this idea that, like, he would step away from cybernetics. Himself and Wiener had, like, they could not see eye to eye, and he didn't like a lot of the kind of second-order ideas, and was more focused on the first-order, purely engineering approaches. And so, wow, that terminology, that AI terminology, really started with him, and it's kind of moved on from there. But anyway, Catherine Hales points out these kind of like two tensions between these two camps. You've got this one first-order camp who are just all about homeostasis. They make sense of their cybernetic systems in terms of Claude Shannon's information theory. He was involved in the original set of conferences, the Macy conferences, which were from the mid-40s to just after World War II to the mid-50s, where a lot of these ideas originally kind of came from. But he was, his information theory was kind of taken on as a key part of cybernetics. And that's what the focus of those systems was. It was dealing with that kind of information theory. The role of the human in this was a kind of noisy, unreliable information processor that would eventually be replaced by a machine. So they didn't see much role for the human, but for the humanities in a broader sense. It was very much about creating machines that would drive themselves, power themselves, and do their own kind of things. And a lot of early conversations at the Macy conferences were focused on, as you could imagine, weaponry and autonomous tanks in particular, which isn't too surprising. And in that context, that's where a lot of this, the idea of the human as an unreliable information processor came from. It's like a human who's driving a tank might actually not want to kill someone, and that could be a problem. So instead, they're like, we'll have to create some kind of system that can automatically do this for us, and that's kind of where we are now today, which is sort of chilling. But the second order camp, focused on reflexivity, were more worried about meaning. So like this was driven by a lot of the ideas of a guy called Donald McKay, right? So his focus was on meaning making and how like human reflexivity, human subjectivity can take information and turn it into meaning. So they weren't rejecting the homeostasis camp in the same way the homeostasis camp often rejected their approaches. I've just taken this other table here because I know this is kind of like tricky, from a guy called Umpleby, a 2017 paper, who's actually talking in, again, a kind of management and organizational management kind of context, but he just has a really nice table of how different thinkers would have approached the two different kind of cybernetic movements. So the first is von Forster, who is a second-order cyberneticist, where he was originally, when he was doing first-order work, worried about the cybernetics of observed systems. He started to worry more about the cybernetics of observing systems and actually wrote a book called Observing Systems on that topic. Gordon Pask, who was all about communication, and he had this conversation theory, was very focused on the purpose of a model within cybernetics, and then started to think more about the modeler and how the person who creates the system affects the system. Same with Varela. Varela was the biologist, cognitive scientist, who was interested in controlled systems, but through his theories of autopoiesis, which we really don't have time to go into now, he got more interested in creating autonomous systems. So systems that operate themselves, but they're not necessarily controlled externally. And then Umpleby put his own two in the table, which I included because it's his table, but they're not very important. All right, so within all of this context is this cybernetic context, is this idea of the smart city, because I was using data from sensors that are traditionally thought of in this smart cities context. So I want to talk a little bit about that particular horror show. So smart cities, to follow the kind of official party line, use IoT sensor networks to manage, govern, and define civil resources and policies within an urban area. They're underpinned by Internet of Things technologies, usually networks of everyday devices that enable, the Internet of Things contains networks of, devices all over the place, everyday devices that talk to each other, they exchange information. At this point, they're kind of a lot more, proliferated. They're heavily proliferated around Cork. There was a big smart cities project in Cork a few years back. So there's kind of a lot of those devices still in play here, although it is very hard to get access to that data here for some reason, which is interesting. But anyway, smart cities are built on this idea of first-order cybernetics. So specifically, cyber-physical social systems is the kind of terminology that's used to talk about these now, but they all have their kind of original grounding in the ideas of a guy called J.W. Forrester, who himself was very interested in cybernetics. He developed cybernetic models of factories. That was his original focus. If you look over here on the right at this little diagram, this is kind of like the lowest level of his thinking. This is like the root of his circuit that he used to make sense of cities. And it's very much like the kind of thermostat idea again. You've got like some kind of thing happening out in the world. You get a rate off it that controls some kind of system that passes its idea back. And it's this kind of very basic kind of first-order cybernetic idea. But he applied cybernetics to create this kind of abstract generic systems model that would describe all possible cities, right? And he had this like infamous quote in an Adam Curtis documentary, the one with the name from the Brodekin poem, I forget the name, but something about machines and grace, the infamous Brodekin poem. Thank you. But really laying bare his entire kind of approach to this. He said, we live in these networks of feedback loops which are controlling us and most things we interact with. So he's very much a first order kind of thinker. But the problem with this is his book claims that it can serve an awful lot or solve an awful lot of urban problems. And he doesn't, well, he does actually. Yeah, it's not a great read. Interestingly, in the preface of the book, it opens saying, I've been criticized for not talking to any actual urban planners or sociologists or people who study cities in this book, but what they don't understand is this is pure mathematics, and they don't need to worry about it, which is kind of crazy. But the basic idea of our kind of smart cities and IoT technologies today is this machine-to-machine communication idea. This underlying idea is that the machines will talk to each other, we'll have sensors, they'll drop their information in a database, we'll analyze it, we'll do something on the basis of it, we can remove people from the equation and the cities can run themselves, essentially. So it's very much this first-order approach. All right. With maybe the exception of some of the stuff that Francesca Bria did in Barcelona a few years back, but that's a story for another day. Okay, I don't need to tell you guys about the pitfalls of smart cities. It should be super, super obvious. Huge questions of data sovereignty issues, security and privacy, monitoring or surveillance, just the fact that all this data can be used, taken from you, sold to massive corporations to kind of understand your kind of, how you live your life so that they can sell you more stuff. And that's, if you're lucky, is the sell you more stuff part. Right, so my strategy when I was working with this kind of data was just to focus on open GDPR compliance stuff, nothing that could give any personal information about people, just high-level kind of data. So my kind of interest from the cybernetics point of view was, can we move into some kind of second-order cybernetics in the context of the smart city? Can we somehow rescue some of these technologies that could, if they were used in an interesting way, be useful and good and positive for our lives? And could we kind of recover the human in the loop and move away from this kind of first-order foundation for the smart city? And being a musician who loves generative music, and, you know, if you're a hammer, every problem is a nail, I decided music was the way to go. So just like a quick overview of generative music as it relates to cybernetics. Essentially, the big crossover with generative music and cybernetics, and this has also come up before, is in Brian Eno's work, because he was very much influenced by Stafford Beard. There's a great line, well, a couple of paragraphs in Andrew Pickering's book on cybernetics, where he's talking about Eno's relationship to Stafford Beard, and how Beard had met him once, and they'd gone for a walk, and he'd asked him to take over as like the forefront of the cybernetic movement in Britain, and Brian Eno just kind of politely declined. Which just, the image of it is just quite hilarious. But anyway, Brian Eno commented quite early on, to Whitaker, who was Stafford Beer's biographer in 2003, Beer's work so fundamentally changed the way that I thought about music that it's very difficult to translate into individual things. It just changed the whole way I work. Stafford, for me, was the doorway into a whole new way of thinking. So Eno's kind of general approach, as we probably all are well aware of here, is system-propagated music of near infinite variety. It's very much informed by Stafford Beer's ideas. So the infamous Eno essay from 1976, Generating and Organizing Variety in the Arts, specifically says he's applying principles from Stafford Beer's approach. He's also taking Ross Ashby's idea of variety as all the possible things a cybernetic system can output, and that's the variety of the title there. So more recently, a lot of Margaret Bowden's work is focused on generative art in a more general sense, describes generative art as art that is generated at least in part by some process that is not under the artist's direct control. So the composer kind of adopts the role of a planner, creates a system, sets it up, lets it go, and they become the audience. The notorious oblique strategy card from Brian Eno again had the kind of note that, it's an approach where this is about gardening. You're setting something up and allow it to grow, as opposed to architecture where you have complete control over the system. And we see this in discrete music and ambient 1 or 2 of the earlier examples of this kind of music. But anyway, the important part here is where Darren Pickles comes in and points out many, many years later, this was very much a second-order approach to cybernetics. Eno's approach and a few other composers in similar vein to him had an approach that could relate to the human and could integrate the human back into these cybernetic systems. They weren't closed off and they weren't closing the human out. They weren't the pure black box. It could be done in such a way that the human was brought in. And you kind of see this on the insert here on the right, the diagram from discrete music, describing, Eno just kind of lays out, well, this is how I made this album. This is essentially the looping system. And that information was kind of like there for the audience. The audience were part of the thing and kind of experiencing the system not in a kind of blind way where they're just paying attention to the outputs. But anyway, importantly, cybernetic music, I've already hit 20 minutes, Jesus. Cybernetic music, according to Pickles, has 4 main kind of things about it. There's this idea of looping, obviously, is huge. The idea of an autopoietic system. So we'll just say, for today's purposes, self-constituting, self-organizing systems. The use of reflexivity, where there's human involved in key points in the system, even if it's only listening to outputs and going, yeah, I really like that output, I think I'll use that for something, and maybe not this one. And a focus on this idea that self-organization would lead to evolution of the system somehow, that would then lead to emergence. That's a really tricky idea because emergence is this idea that the whole can be much greater than the sum of its parts. Sometimes that can be true of a system, sometimes it's not, but they're very hard things to prove and they're very hard ideas to pin down. But yet you see a lot of talk about emergence in generative and digital art in general. Okay, so in an attempt to apply all these ideas to do something, I created a system back in 2017 that would use IoT network data from noise sensors to control music parameters of a generative system. So it was a looping system that would essentially record guitar loops, and then on the basis of how the noise levels were around the town at that given time, elements of the guitar loops would be changed, like how long a loop might be, for example, would be changed. So decisions were made by the noise in the town, and also a little cellular automata system, which is an automated little algorithm that kind of makes music I could use to map to musical choices. Give you an overview of that. Oh yeah, and that was first performed down for Sonic Dreams back in 2017. So to give you an overview of a system like this, you essentially have some kind of looping system set up. So this is where I was recording in guitar, for example. But then at each of these different nodes along the way, I was pulling in noise data from different locations around Dublin and mapping them to control things like the application of reverb, the overall amplitude of different tracks. When I was kind of applying buffer and delays, kind of buffer delays where you take your audio, chop it up and then play it back. It was defining buffer sizes and delay times and stuff like that. And I have an audio example of what some of this sounds like. Recorded at the actual day it was performed. So you hear these kind of light, airy kind of passages. That means that the kind of the data for those kind of sensors was the noise levels were fairly low. And then when noise levels would cross a certain threshold, the noise would get that much more intense. And abrasive, purposefully abrasive, to kind of reflect the noise of. And I absolutely hate that, so we're moving on. 7 years ago. So the next kind of approach was to take this idea, throw away all the bits that didn't work, so the guitar went away, the horrible kind of synthy noise went away, and this became a project that focused primarily on trying to write these systems, these little decision-making systems in Python, using a MIDI protocol to then map information across to Ableton Live to control some sound synthesis parameters. But it involved creating this kind of like decision loop structure where you've got data coming in to kind of define two decision loops. One loop that's kind of like focusing on what you're playing and how that should be presented, essentially, changing parameters of your performance, and a second loop that's deciding how things should play alongside you. And that is very close to what we heard here the other day, because it was that system I pulled out. Okay. After that, I tried to focus on kind of allowing the data to speak for itself a little bit more, so using a lot more data to map to a lot more parameters. That's really noisy and horrible, so I have no example of that. And finally, during COVID, all of this had to move on, move online, I should say, so it became essentially a JavaScript kind of implementation of the overall thing online. And then more recently, it's been installed for the wrong Biennale as a mobile accessible installation. All right, and that's 25 minutes, so that's plenty. Thanks very much.